Hey guys, tonight we step into a world where the sun barely cuts through the fog-drenched streets of medieval villages, and the sound of a stray dog barking can make you jump out of your boots. You probably won't survive this, or at least not without a few sleepless nights. But don't worry, I'm here to guide you safely, with only a whisper of fear and a touch of amusement. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's oddly comforting to know who else is tiptoeing through these shadowed alleys with us tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along the cobblestone streets, and every flicker of torchlight seems to create more shadows than it dispels. The villages of medieval Europe were tiny clusters of timber-framed houses, thatched roofs, and narrow lanes, where gossip traveled faster than the blacksmith's hammer. You notice how the air smells of smoke, damp earth, and the occasional hint of herbs meant to ward off disease or evil spirits. The peasant population whispers constantly about strange disappearances, livestock gone missing, and children who vanish as easily as the morning mist. You might think these are mere rumors, the product of overactive imaginations fueled by superstition. But historians still argue whether these fears were exaggerated or grounded in real, sinister events. One of the most chilling aspects of village life was the proximity of danger. Unlike today, where crimes are often random and fleeting, medieval villagers lived shoulder to shoulder with potential murderers. A stranger passing through could be as deadly as a neighbor harboring a dark secret. You probably wouldn't want to stroll down the lane after dusk. Even the flicker of candlelight in a window could make your pulse quicken. And yet, life continued, stubbornly persistent, much like the weeds sprouting between cobblestones. There's a quirky detail worth noting here. Some villagers believed that sprinkling crocodile dung outside doors would deter witches and malevolent spirits. Imagine that, the pungent smell of dried crocodile waste acting as medieval security. Whether it worked? Probably not. Did it make the neighborhood stink? Absolutely. You can almost picture the children holding their noses while adults nodded solemnly, convinced the barrier between safety and death had been reinforced. Beyond superstition, real dangers lurked in the form of serial offenders. Think of this shadow over the village, not just as metaphorical darkness, but as actual human predators. Some preyed quietly on the vulnerable, children, travelers, or the occasional wealthy merchant who ventured too close to the wrong alley. Others left behind more subtle trails, livestock missing, strange marks in the mud, or cryptic symbols scrawled near a water pump. These hints would be whispered about in the marketplace, growing into stories that would haunt families for generations. You notice how even the natural elements contributed to the ominous atmosphere. Fog rolled over fields, hiding the movements of anyone, or anything, prowling the night. Birds, sensing danger, would flee in startled flocks, their wings beating against the cold evening air. Dogs growled or whimpered in uneasy corners, their instincts sharp enough to sense threats humans couldn't yet name. Historians still argue whether these ominous signs inspired some of the earliest accounts of serial killers in Europe, or if they merely amplified the fear that already existed among the superstitious villagers. And then there's the sensory detail that seems almost cinematic. Imagine walking past a well at midnight, the moon reflecting off the water's surface, casting dancing shapes onto the nearby wall. You hear the faint clang of the blacksmith's hammer from earlier in the day, now muffled and ghost-like. Somewhere in the distance, a cart creaks as it moves slowly, though you can't see anyone driving it. Your imagination runs wild. Did someone slip away into the shadows? Or is it simply your mind, dancing on the knife edge between fear and curiosity? It's also worth noting that medieval villagers relied heavily on communal vigilance. Night watches were common. Townsfolk would take turns patrolling streets or keeping an eye on the gates. Lanterns were hung in windows, not just to illuminate, but as signals of life and safety. Yet, despite all precautions, there remained that creeping uncertainty. Who could you trust? The baker who smiled at you daily? The monk who prayed beside the altar? Even your closest neighbors were potential suspects in whispered rumors of past crimes. And that, perhaps more than anything, kept everyone perpetually on edge, their lives intertwined with the looming specter of danger. As you continue walking through this imagined village, consider this. Fear was a constant companion, shaping behaviors, conversations, and even architecture. Homes had high walls and small windows. Doors were reinforced with iron, not merely for privacy, but to protect inhabitants from real threats. Villagers carried knives or improvised weapons, sometimes disguised as tools, because in these times, self-defense wasn't optional. It was survival. And yet, life went on. Children played cautiously, markets bustled, and churches held services, all under the shadow of potential horror. Quirky asides persisted amidst the terror. Some believed that wearing a rabbit's foot or a charm around the neck could ward off murderers, not just spirits. Others painted protective symbols on door frames or carved runes into their beams. Historians still argue whether these were simply rituals born of fear or an early understanding of psychological comfort, a way to feel safe in an unsafe world. And as you navigate this eerie environment, you can't help but notice that these little human gestures, no matter how small, shape the social fabric just as much as the crimes themselves. You trudge past the village center, the marketplace now silent, empty stalls casting long shadows. You remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we joked about earlier? It's strangely fitting. In a world without police, surveillance, or forensic science, every precaution, no matter how absurd it seems today, was part of a patchwork defense against the unseen predators that haunted these streets. And lurking in those shadows, whether real or imagined, is where our story begins, weaving together superstition, terror, and the cold logic of human malice into a tapestry that you're only just beginning to unravel. You step further into the village, and the cobblestones beneath your feet seem to hum with stories. Some whispered, some shouted, all carrying the scent of history tinged with fear. The air feels heavier here, thick with the memory of deeds so dark that even the bravest souls prefer to glance quickly and walk on. You probably wouldn't linger long in the village square if it weren't for curiosity nudging you forward. The same curiosity that makes you peek behind doors and wonder about the lives that once teetered on the edge of madness. Understanding the mind of a medieval malefactor is a curious exercise in balancing fact, theory, and speculation. You imagine a person living in cramped, smoke-filled homes, with little education and a daily struggle for survival, yet possessing a mind that charts cunning, obsession, and deliberate malice. Historians still argue whether these killers were born from inherent psychopathy, environmental pressures, or simply twisted interpretations of medieval morality. You might picture one of them, hands calloused from labor, eyes sharp and calculating, walking past neighbors with a polite nod masking a dark plan. Medieval life was rife with stressors that could push someone toward crime. Famines, disease, and poverty weren't merely inconveniences, they were existential threats. Add superstition, religious fervor, and a rigid social hierarchy, and it's easy to see why some minds fractured under pressure. Imagine waking up to rumors of plague in the next village, your livestock mysteriously dying, and everyone around you quietly pointing fingers at neighbors. In such a world, the boundary between ordinary suspicion and outright violence could blur dangerously. Some malefactors became adept at exploiting local beliefs. One fringe tale tells of a shadow man who used mirrors and candles to create the illusion of apparitions, frightening victims into isolation before striking. While modern historians debate the authenticity of these stories, they illustrate the creativity and cunning employed by some killers. You can almost see the reflection of flickering torchlight in a mirror, watching someone tremble, oblivious to the trap being set just behind them. The psychology of these killers often intertwined with religion. Some believe their acts were justified by divine commands or the need to punish sinners, a chilling echo of moral absolutism gone awry. Others committed crimes for personal gain, using fear as a tool to control communities. You notice how these motivations were rarely simple. They were layered with social pressure, superstition, and opportunity, creating a perfect storm of calculated cruelty. The village itself becomes part of the psychology. Narrow alleys, hidden courtyards, and poorly lit streets provided cover for deeds that today would be nearly impossible to conceal. You imagine a malefactor slipping silently through a side gate, a dagger or vial of poison concealed in their sleeve, eyes darting to ensure no one watches. That sense of omnipresent observation, neighbors always glancing, children always listening, only heightened the thrill and risk, creating a dance between predator and prey that could last for weeks, months, or years. Quirky asides were common in these tales. Some murderers left peculiar signatures, a ring turned backward, a cryptic symbol etched in soot, or a random object left at the scene, almost like a calling card. While historians debate whether these behaviors were deliberate psychological games or later embellishments, they reveal the eerie interplay between fact and folklore in our understanding of medieval malefactors. You can picture villagers discovering such tokens and exchanging nervous glances, trying to decipher whether it was a warning, a joke, or a prelude to disaster. You notice that community response shaped the malefactor's mind as much as their environment. Fear inspired both overreaction and clever manipulation. A clever criminal could exploit gossip, spread rumors, or feign innocence while orchestrating chaos. Think about that. A person walking beside you in the market, nodding cheerfully, while secretly plotting their next strike. It's almost cinematic, yet entirely plausible in a time when law enforcement was minimal and the line between rumor and evidence was as thin as a candle flame. Even the simplest daily acts could be twisted into terror. A basket of apples left at the edge of the village square, a dog barking at a shadow, or a misplaced footstep at night could signal the presence of someone dangerous. The malefactor learned to read these cues with precision, exploiting both natural anxiety and village superstition. You probably wouldn't survive long in such an environment if you weren't equally adept at observing, interpreting, and surviving. You trudge past the bakery, inhaling the faint scent of bread and smoke, and it's almost comforting, yet the knowledge of hidden danger lingers. You recall tales of malefactors hiding in plain sight, sometimes masquerading as pious citizens or wandering beggars. Their duality, ordinary by day, predator by night, remains one of the most chilling aspects of medieval criminal psychology. You can almost hear the whispers of the townsfolk as they try to reconcile what they see with what they fear. And, of course, there's the matter of opportunity. Isolation, darkness, and minimal oversight provided the perfect environment for these individuals. Villagers who returned late from the fields or markets risked more than fatigue. They risked becoming a statistic in an unrecorded horror story. Historians still argue whether some disappearances were the work of a single person, multiple opportunists, or simply tragic accidents later exaggerated by folklore. Either way, the tension of anticipation, never knowing who might be watching, waiting, or planning, is almost tangible as you continue your slow walk through the imagined streets. As you wander, you begin to understand the dual nature of the malefactor. Part ordinary villager, part calculated predator, and part product of an unforgiving society. Their minds, shaped by fear, necessity, and cunning, operated in a delicate balance between brilliance and madness. You probably won't see them coming, but you can feel the shadow of their thought process in every quiet corner, every flicker of movement, and every whispered rumor carried on the wind. The marketplace is silent now, your footsteps echoing faintly against the rough-hewn stone, and you can almost smell the tang of iron in the air, whether from the blacksmith's forge or something darker, you can't be sure. Tonight, you follow a thread of fear that winds through the alleys and courtyards, the subtle, sinister art of poison. You probably won't sip from a chalice carelessly after hearing this, and that's a survival instinct your medieval counterparts would have desperately needed. Poisons were both the science and the theater of medieval crime. You trudge past an inn, imagining a wealthy traveler reclining at a wooden table, the flicker of candlelight casting long shadows across the floorboards. One misstep, one sip from a spiked goblet, and the story of their life could end quietly and efficiently. Herbs, mushrooms, and subtle concoctions were wielded like silent weapons, a sharp contrast to the more overt brutality of knives or clubs. Historians still argue whether some of these poisonings were accidental misuses of natural substances or deliberate acts of calculated homicide. The knowledge required to craft a lethal potion was surprisingly advanced. Villagers often relied on local apothecaries or wandering alchemists who carried powders, tinctures, and mixtures that could kill, induce illness, or mimic natural disease. You probably wouldn't survive long if you mistakenly trusted a suspiciously helpful herbalist, because some were notorious for testing their creations on the unsuspecting. In fringe accounts, there are stories of poisons delivered via baked goods or wine, sometimes hidden in plain sight in a bustling tavern. You can picture the subtle exchange of a loaf or the careful placement of a vial as part of an almost ritualistic performance. But poison wasn't only about subtlety, it carried psychological weight. The fear of being poisoned transformed ordinary acts, eating, drinking, even shaking hands, into exercises in vigilance. Villagers learned to inspect food for discoloration, odd smells, or unfamiliar textures. Some carried personal charms or tiny tools, secretly scraping surfaces or testing liquids. You remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from the earlier streets? Well, in a sense, every precaution against poison was a medieval version of that. Messy, slightly absurd, yet oddly comforting in its own way. The most infamous poisoners often became legends in their own time. Some were women, quietly operating in kitchens, monasteries, or noble households, exploiting access and trust. Others were men with grudge-fueled vendettas or a taste for manipulation. One fringe story tells of a poisoner who allegedly tested their mixtures on stray cats, watching for subtle reactions before attempting them on human victims, a horrifying precursor to modern forensic trials, though historians still debate its veracity. The concept, however, illustrates the mix of science, experimentation, and outright cruelty that characterized some of these individuals. You trudged down a narrow lane, imagining how easy it was to remain undetected. Unlike violent attacks, poison allowed a killer to maintain social standing and deflect suspicion. A single slip or misjudgment could ruin a life, but when executed successfully, the act was almost invisible. It's a kind of stealthy artistry, if a twisted one, where timing, knowledge of human physiology, and observation of behavior determine the outcome. Villagers might whisper about suspicious illnesses, but often the trail went cold, leaving fear and paranoia to fester unchecked. Then there's the curious quirks. Poisoners sometimes left subtle signatures, whether an odd mark on a cup or a specific arrangement of herbs. Some historians suggest these were meant to communicate with fellow conspirators or send a warning. Others argue they were embellishments by storytellers eager to turn criminals into legends. You probably wouldn't survive a dinner in such an environment if you weren't alert, observant, and occasionally skeptical of even the most ordinary courtesies. The social response was just as intriguing. Fear of poisoning led to rituals of protection, licking spoons before meals, boiling water multiple times, or using specialized utensils. Entire households sometimes became laboratories of vigilance, with every meal scrutinized, every visitor questioned. And while some of these precautions may have seemed excessive, they reflect the ingenuity of people trying to survive in a world where science and superstition intertwined seamlessly. You wander past a candlelit window and imagine the subtle tension inside. A servant places wine before a noble, eyes darting nervously. Perhaps it's a simple mistake, or perhaps it's an orchestrated plan for death. You probably won't see the difference, and that's the essence of the fear poison instilled: uncertainty, doubt, and the creeping suspicion that anyone could be an instrument of death. And of course, pandemics and illnesses complicated matters. Symptoms of poisoning could be indistinguishable from disease, a fortuitous cover for killers who exploited confusion and fear. You recall the stories from plague years, when death was everywhere, yet some victims might have been specifically targeted. Historians still argue whether poisoners thrived in such chaotic times, or if the disease itself simply masked natural causes. Either way, the psychological effect remained. The idea that death could be anywhere, even in a simple meal, kept people cautious and watchful. In the shadows of these narrow streets, poisoners thrived on a blend of knowledge, observation, and human error. You probably wouldn't survive long without suspicion guiding every sip, every bite, every glance. The line between accidental death and premeditated murder was as thin as the edge of a dagger, and navigating it required intelligence, timing, and a strange kind of patience. And as you move through this imagined village, you can sense that the quietest killers, often hiding in plain sight, were sometimes the most terrifying of all. You step out of the inn's shadow and onto a winding road that stretches into the darkened countryside. The moon is a pale smear behind clouds, barely illuminating the path, and you notice how even familiar surroundings can take on an ominous cast at night. You probably wouldn't survive long wandering alone here without nerves of steel, or a sharp awareness of the shadows that cling to every hedge, tree, and abandoned cart. Tonight, the predators are not in houses or kitchens. They are the night stalkers and highwaymen who made travel a deadly gamble in medieval times. These killers thrived on isolation and vulnerability. A lone traveler, even a well-armed merchant, could fall prey to someone who knew the terrain like the back of their hand. You imagine someone crouching behind a fence, cloak blending into the darkness, eyes glinting as they track footsteps echoing across the uneven path. Historians still argue whether some highwaymen were opportunistic thieves or deliberate serial predators, but the terror they instilled in communities was undeniable. Villagers told tales of travelers vanishing without a trace, leaving horses standing alone in moonlit clearings, saddlebags open, yet empty of human presence. Night travel was both necessity and risk. Merchants carried goods essential for local economies, and messengers bore news critical for the social fabric. Their paths crossed with shadowy figures who learned to manipulate fear, using darkness, sound, and the landscape itself to isolate victims. Imagine the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, and the heart-thumping realization that someone is moving silently alongside you. The thrill and danger were inseparable, an eerie dance between predator and prey. Quirky tidbits pepper these tales. Some highwaymen wore masks made of animal hide, or even painted themselves to resemble mythical creatures, hoping to startle or confuse victims before striking. Others left calling cards, such as a carved symbol on a tree or an unusual feather tucked into a pouch, which may have served as warnings or psychological games to assert dominance. You probably wouldn't survive long ignoring these subtle signs, because they often contained more truth than the chatter of village gossip. The psychology of night stalkers is fascinating. They relied on fear itself as a weapon, understanding that panic could slow a target, separate companions, or even cause someone to make fatal mistakes. You can imagine a merchant hesitating at a crossroads, the moonlight reflecting off a dagger as a shadowy figure emerges, an unsettling mixture of calculation and opportunism. Historians still argue whether some individuals were true serial killers, driven by obsession, or merely pragmatic criminals exploiting circumstance and timing. The countryside itself provided cover. Hedgerows, narrow paths, and dense forests created natural choke points where travelers could be ambushed. A single misstep could send you into a trap, or worse, into the reach of someone who had studied your habits and routes for weeks. Villagers who regularly traveled these roads developed rituals of protection, traveling in groups, carrying talismans, or timing journeys to coincide with other known travelers. Yet, even these precautions could fail. You notice how these night stalkers were often social chameleons by day. Some were innkeepers, stable hands, or wandering musicians, blending seamlessly into the village life, only revealing their predatory nature under the cover of darkness. It's a duality that is almost cinematic, ordinary by morning, lethal by night. You probably wouldn't survive a casual encounter with such a person without vigilance, because their outward appearance offered no hint of the danger they carried. Local legends amplified the fear. Stories spread of figures who could vanish into the mist, ghostly apparitions said to be the spirits of those who had disappeared. Some accounts claimed the stalkers had supernatural aid, perhaps a pact with dark forces or the cunning of a mind attuned to the occult. Historians still argue whether these tales were based on actual killings or were later embellishments meant to warn travelers and entertain storytellers. Regardless, the combination of fact, folklore, and superstition created a landscape in which survival depended on both caution and intuition. Even small communities had their own patrols, neighbors walking the edges of forests, lanterns raised, voices low, ears straining for the slightest sound. Yet, despite these measures, night stalkers maintained an almost legendary status. Unseen, unpredictable, and always a step ahead. You can almost feel the tension, the heightened senses, and the adrenaline-fueled decisions that defined life on these roads. You trudge past an abandoned cart, imagining it as a potential trap, and realize how vulnerable anyone traveling alone truly was. The shadowed countryside, the isolation, and the unknown made each journey a test of nerve. You probably wouldn't survive without understanding both the landscape and the psychology of those who lurked within it. How the stalker's mind measured opportunity, fear, and timing in a precise rhythm honed by experience. And yet, there's an odd beauty in this peril. The night, the rustling leaves, and the quiet anticipation form a strange ballet between life and death. You remember the lessons from village superstition, the crocodile dung sunscreen, the flickering mirrors, and the subtle warnings, the ingenuity of ordinary people trying to protect themselves from extraordinary threats. Night stalkers and highwaymen were more than criminals. They were catalysts for caution, imagination, and survival instincts that shaped the medieval psyche. You leave the forested path behind and approach the looming silhouette of a castle, its high stone walls cutting jagged shapes against the moonlit sky. The scent of damp stone and moss mixes with the faint tang of smoke from the chimneys. You probably wouldn't survive long inside these walls if you underestimated the danger, not just from outsiders, but from the deadly intrigues simmering within. Tonight, the story moves from open roads to the shadowed halls of nobility, where ambition, envy, and betrayal often ended in murder. Castle life was not the romanticized picture of knights and feasts you might expect. Narrow corridors, hidden staircases, and secret chambers offered both protection and peril. Lords and ladies were embroiled in constant political maneuvering, and a single misstep could result in death, or worse, a slow, lingering fall from favor that left one vulnerable to more subtle forms of elimination. Historians still argue whether certain notorious deaths were accidents, executions, or deliberate acts by family members or rivals. You trudge past the main gate, imagining the tension that permeated the stone walls, where even the sound of a footstep could betray intent. One of the most infamous forms of castle crime was the slow, deliberate assassination. A whisper in the ear, a poisoned goblet, or a sudden accident on the stairs. You probably wouldn't survive long as a political pawn in these halls unless you had allies, keen observation, and a healthy dose of suspicion. The human mind, it seems, has always been capable of cunning that borders on artistry, using the environment itself as part of the plot. Hidden doors, sliding panels, and cleverly placed arrow slits offered opportunities for both defense and offense, blurring the lines between safe spaces and traps. Quirky details pepper the stories. Some nobles allegedly employed secret signals to warn of threats. A specific banner raised, a candle placed unusually, or even a strategically dropped glove. Others used trained animals, hawks, dogs, or even monkeys, to guard certain passages or deliver messages in times of intrigue. While historians debate how widespread these practices truly were, the notion of a castle as a living, breathing web of observation and suspicion is undeniable. You can almost hear the faint scratching of a servant's shoe in a hidden corridor, knowing that eyes might be watching from the stone shadows. Power struggles were a breeding ground for murder. Heirs argued over inheritance, courtiers schemed for influence, and wives, often trapped in arranged marriages, navigated their own webs of survival and manipulation. Some women, surprisingly clever and resourceful, became skilled in subtle forms of murder or coercion. You probably wouldn't survive long if you assumed that gender determined threat level. Medieval castles were arenas where intellect, opportunity, and audacity mattered more than brute strength. The psychological toll was profound. Lords, ladies, and servants alike lived in a constant state of caution. Trust was scarce, and alliances shifted like sand. A friendly smile in the hall might mask lethal intent. A whispered compliment could conceal a deadly plan. Historians still argue whether paranoia in these settings was rational or a reflection of chronic stress amplified by isolation and rigid social hierarchy. And as you move through the imagined halls, you can feel that tension settling into your own chest, a rhythm almost like a heartbeat synced to the castle's dark pulse. Courts were often scenes of subtle intimidation. Witnesses could vanish, accusations could shift, and a carefully planted rumor could be as dangerous as a blade. Poison, knives, and staged accidents were the preferred instruments of those wishing to remove obstacles without attracting open suspicion. You probably wouldn't survive as a pawn or observer if you ignored the delicate balance of appearances and reality, a balance carefully monitored, manipulated, and sometimes shattered by individuals who thrived in secrecy. The architectural quirks of castles themselves played a role. Narrow spiral staircases favored right-handed attackers descending from above. Secret alcoves offered vantage points for observation. High towers created both refuge and prison. You can almost see a shadow flit past a wall niche, a dagger glinting in candlelight, a plot unfolding with silent precision. Some accounts tell of chambers specifically designed to trap or isolate victims. Historians still debate the practicality of these features versus their exaggeration in storytelling, but the fear they inspired was very real. Every castle had its stories of betrayal. Servants who betrayed their masters, siblings who plotted against each other, and knights who turned allegiance for gain created a web that was as lethal as any battlefield. You probably wouldn't survive long by ignoring these dynamics. Even casual observation could reveal subtle cues, a nervous glance, a hesitating step, or a servant who avoided certain corridors. Reading human behavior was as crucial as understanding architecture or weaponry. Quirky, fringe tales add color to the dread. Some nobles supposedly employed doppelganger decoys to confuse assassins, while others used enchanted mirrors or complex signal systems. While modern historians debate whether these accounts are myth or exaggeration, they reflect the ingenuity and sometimes sheer eccentricity of those who navigated castle politics. And through it all, fear and vigilance intertwined, creating an environment in which survival required both intellect and instinct. As you trudge past the banquet hall, imagining the flicker of torchlight on gilded walls, it's clear that castles were not merely homes. They were theaters of power, ambition, and hidden violence. You probably wouldn't survive long if you assumed a roof over your head guaranteed safety. Every corner, every shadow, every echo could harbor danger, reminding you that in the medieval world, even the most fortified spaces could conceal deadly minds at work. You leave the echoing stone halls behind and find yourself wandering near the quiet cloisters of a monastery. The air is thick with incense, and the faint chanting of monks drifts through the corridors, almost hypnotic in its rhythm. You probably won't survive long assuming these sacred spaces were exempt from darkness, because behind the piety and prayer, secrets festered, and sometimes death walked quietly in robes of devotion. Monasteries and convents were supposed to be sanctuaries, but history whispers otherwise. Some inhabitants harbored grudges, obsessions, or a thirst for power that turned devotion into a guise for manipulation. Imagine a cloistered monk, hood drawn low, eyes scanning for the perfect moment, while the abbey bell tolls innocently in the distance. Historians still argue whether tales of murder within religious houses were widespread or exaggerated by chroniclers eager to discredit the church, but the stories persist, weaving unease into the serene stone and gardens. Life inside these walls was a delicate balance of ritual, labor, and isolation. Silence dominated many hours, yet whispers of intrigue threaded through the corridors. You trudge along the stone floors, imagining secret messages slipped between cells, coded notes hidden in hymn books, and the careful observation of routines to exploit vulnerabilities. Even acts as mundane as distributing bread or water could become vehicles for subtle menace. You probably wouldn't survive long as a newcomer unaware of the unspoken hierarchies and hidden resentments that governed every interaction. Quirky asides add color to this shadowed world. Some nuns reportedly used herbs not only for healing, but for more sinister purposes, inducing sleep or mild illness as a way to settle disputes or exert control. Others are said to have whispered curses into the gardens at night, blending superstition with strategy. Historians still argue whether these acts were symbolic, practical, or pure invention, but they certainly shaped the perception of danger and fear within monastic walls. The motives were complex. Some religious killers acted out of ambition, striving to secure influence over abbeys or control over charitable resources. Others were driven by jealousy, desire, or personal vendettas. And, of course, some were simply opportunists, exploiting the trust inherent in cloistered life to harm those they saw as weak or threatening. You notice how the interplay between sacred authority and human weakness created a paradoxical environment where the spiritual ideal coexisted with mortal danger. Surveillance was often subtle but effective. Monks and nuns were trained to observe carefully, to note deviations in behavior, and to record transgressions in the margins of ledgers. In the wrong hands, these skills could be weaponized, with knowledge of routines or secrets enabling premeditated harm. You probably wouldn't survive long under such scrutiny if you had anything to hide, or even a tendency toward naivety. It's a delicate dance of observation and manipulation, with spiritual and temporal stakes intertwined. One of the most fascinating aspects is the duality of the setting. Cloisters were designed for reflection and meditation, yet the architecture itself could facilitate both observation and concealment. Narrow passageways, hidden staircases, and small windows offered vantage points for watching and eavesdropping. You can almost see a shadow slipping silently along a corridor, a candle flame reflecting off polished tiles, someone calculating a moment to strike, or simply to gather information. The tension between public ritual and private intrigue was palpable. Quirky legends persist, too. Some monks supposedly hid poisons in holy water fonts, or slipped messages written in invisible ink using natural substances. Others employed cryptic symbols etched into walls as warnings or threats. Historians still argue about the accuracy of these accounts, but the cultural impact is undeniable. The idea that sacred spaces could conceal deadly intent made monasteries simultaneously revered and feared. Even mundane acts could carry risk. Sharing a meal, distributing alms, or tending gardens could be exploited by someone calculating harm. You trudge past a refectory, imagining how easily a seemingly innocent loaf of bread or goblet of wine could become a tool in a subtle, lethal plan. Fear and caution were as much part of daily life here as prayer and devotion. And yet, there was a rhythm to it all. Despite the darkness, the majority lived honest, pious lives, their days filled with routine, study, and labor. But the presence of even a single malicious mind could twist that rhythm, turning sanctuary into stage for intrigue. You probably wouldn't survive long ignoring the lessons this duality teaches. Vigilance, perception, and the subtle power of knowledge were as important as faith or moral standing. As you leave the cloisters and step into the soft night beyond the walls, it's clear that danger in medieval religious spaces was not always overt. It hid in observation, manipulation, and small acts turned sinister. You feel the lingering tension, the faint scent of incense, and the echo of chants that mask a darker reality, a reminder that even sanctity could host hidden horrors. You trudge along a narrow, muddy path leading out of the monastery grounds, and the scent of damp earth and decay mixes with the distant tang of smoke from nearby hearths. The world outside seems calmer, yet you probably won't survive long assuming danger has vanished, because now we step into a time when the plague stalked Europe and opportunistic killers saw chaos as their playground. The air itself seems heavy with uncertainty, carrying whispers of fear, death, and human cunning. The Black Death and subsequent pandemics created unprecedented social upheaval. Villagers fled cities, markets emptied, and entire towns vanished under the relentless shadow of disease. Amid this, some individuals exploited panic, using the confusion to commit murders that might otherwise have drawn immediate attention. You can imagine the streets of a deserted village, corpses hastily buried, and a shadowy figure slipping through the fog, eyes scanning for the next victim. Historians still argue whether serial killings increased directly because of the plague or if the chaos merely obscured already existing crimes. Opportunistic killers thrived on the vulnerability of the sick and the isolated. Merchants delivering goods, caregivers tending to the ill, or travelers seeking refuge were easy targets. You probably wouldn't survive long wandering through plague-ridden settlements alone, because those willing to exploit fear understood that suspicion and disorder could be their greatest allies. One fringe tale recounts a figure who marked houses with subtle symbols to indicate wealth or accessibility, returning later under cover of night to commit theft or worse. Whether fact or legend, it captures the eerie blend of resourcefulness and cruelty. Yet it wasn't only opportunists taking advantage of disease. Some killers wielded fear itself as a weapon, spreading rumors of hidden contagion to isolate victims or coerce compliance. Imagine a peasant family terrified to leave their home, forced into submission or lured into dangerous situations by cunning whispers. This psychological manipulation parallels modern concepts of terror-driven crime, proof that the mind can be as lethal a tool as any blade or poison. The plague's disruption of social norms also blurred moral boundaries. Communities were strained, distrust became instinctive, and survival often meant choices that would horrify a modern observer. In these conditions, some individuals rationalized murder as necessity or divine justice. You notice how fear, scarcity, and opportunity intertwined, producing situations in which killers could operate with minimal oversight. Historians still argue whether these rationalizations were genuine belief, sociopathic justification, or simply the veneer applied to cruel acts. Quirky tidbits emerge in this eerie landscape. Some survivors reported that certain criminals disguised themselves as plague doctors, robes and masks lending both protection and intimidation. Others used makeshift signaling systems, bell tolls, or markings to orchestrate attacks under the guise of public safety measures. You probably wouldn't survive if you assumed the appearance of authority guaranteed security. In this world, it often masked menace. Interestingly, opportunistic killers weren't always physically violent. Theft, sabotage, and subtle manipulations could have deadly consequences in a plague-stricken environment. Imagine a person diverting essential supplies, contaminating water sources, or hiding vital medications. While these actions might seem indirect, their effects were often fatal. You can almost see the moral calculus. Act, observe, and exploit a world in which death was already omnipresent. Social responses attempted to counter the threat. Town councils organized watch patrols. Neighbors monitored each other, and some villages created quarantine protocols. Yet, the sheer scale of the crisis meant that enforcement was sporadic at best. Opportunistic killers could slip through these cracks, exploiting human fear, confusion, and desperation. You probably wouldn't survive long ignoring these dynamics, because awareness and vigilance were often the only defense against predation masked by disease. Fringe stories lend a darker layer. Some claim certain individuals intentionally spread contagion to gain power, revenge, or wealth, a chilling echo of modern bioterror concepts. While historians debate the authenticity of such claims, the enduring narrative reveals human fascination with the intersection of disease and deliberate malice. The imagination, it seems, thrives in chaos. You trudge past deserted cottages, their doors hanging loosely, and feel the oppressive tension of unseen threats. It's a landscape in which morality, fear, and opportunism intersect, creating a perfect storm for hidden horrors. Even the simple act of walking through a village could require constant calculation, observing the path, noting shadows, assessing human behavior, and imagining what unseen forces might be waiting. Ultimately, the plague didn't just kill indiscriminately. It reshaped human behavior and provided fertile ground for those inclined to exploit death. You probably won't survive long ignoring the lessons here. Fear can be weaponized, chaos can hide intention, and survival often depends on a keen understanding of both the natural and human threats that stalk the world. And as you continue your journey along the misty paths, the line between disease and deliberate cruelty becomes almost imperceptible, a murky fog through which the deadliest minds of the medieval era moved with uncanny precision. You trudge down a quiet, tree-lined path leading away from the plague-stricken villages, and the evening air carries the faint scent of damp leaves and distant smoke. The world seems eerily calm, yet you probably won't survive long assuming peace equals safety, because now we step into the calculated precision of medieval assassins, whose skills and patience turned murder into an almost artful craft. Assassins of the Middle Ages were often highly trained, whether in the arts of stealth, poison, or social manipulation. They could be hired by nobles to eliminate rivals, or work independently, driven by personal vendettas or ideological motivations. You can picture a hooded figure gliding silently across a courtyard, the heel of their boot pressing lightly against cold stone, while their target remains unaware. Historians still argue whether some infamous assassins were single-handedly responsible for multiple deaths, or if chroniclers exaggerated their exploits to inspire fear or legend. The tools of the trade were both subtle and specialized. Daggers, crossbows, and hidden blades were complemented by knowledge of poisons, choke points, and escape routes. Assassins often studied their targets meticulously, noting routines, habits, and weaknesses. You probably wouldn't survive long if you walked the medieval streets without observing the same patterns, because a single lapse in attention could make you a victim. One fringe tale even describes assassins using trained birds to signal the approach of a target, a mix of ingenuity and eerie theater that blurs the line between reality and legend. Their psychological acumen was as deadly as any weapon. Assassins exploited fear, timing, and social manipulation to create the perfect conditions for a kill. Imagine someone planting false rumors to lure a victim into isolation, or using a staged dispute to distract companions while the deed is done elsewhere. The medieval mind, steeped in superstition and hierarchy, could be easily manipulated, and the assassin's advantage was understanding this blend of psychology and opportunity. Quirky details pepper the stories. Some assassins reportedly left symbolic marks at the scene: a carved rune, a dropped coin, or an arrangement of personal items that communicated a message only other initiates could read. Historians still debate whether these were genuine codes or later embellishments, but they illustrate the human fascination with cleverness and signature in crime. You probably wouldn't survive ignoring the subtle cues scattered through the environment, because they were often the only warning you'd get. Social positioning was crucial. Many assassins operated within noble households, guilds, or religious institutions, using access and trust to their advantage. A seemingly loyal servant or messenger could carry deadly intent, exploiting both opportunity and the illusion of normalcy. You can imagine the tension. Someone smiling, attending to daily tasks, while their mind runs through a lethal sequence of actions with chilling focus. Historians still argue whether some trusted assassins were always complicit or coerced, but the potential for deception was ever present. Assassins' effectiveness was amplified by their understanding of architecture. Narrow alleyways, spiral staircases, and hidden corridors allowed them to strike unseen and vanish. Even public spaces were weaponized. Crowded markets, festivals, and taverns could serve as hunting grounds, with the chaos of human movement masking intent. You probably wouldn't survive unobserved in these environments if you failed to understand both geography and human behavior. Fear was their ally. Assassins thrived on reputation as much as skill. Tales of their exploits spread quickly, making individuals hesitant to travel, merchants cautious in trade, and nobles suspicious of even their closest aides. You can almost hear the whispers in the marketplace. He moves like a shadow. They say he strikes without warning. Reputation became both weapon and armor, amplifying terror beyond the immediate act. Curiously, some assassins also employed ritualistic elements. Masked appearances, ceremonial strikes, or deliberate timing tied to festivals or religious events added psychological weight to their crimes. Whether symbolic or practical, these gestures amplified fear and created stories that persisted long after the events. You probably wouldn't survive the medieval world without recognizing that perception could be as deadly as action itself. In the end, medieval assassins were more than killers. They were strategists, psychologists, and masters of environment and opportunity. Their minds combined patience, observation, and creativity in ways that kept communities on edge. You trudge past the remnants of a fallen watchtower, imagining the calculated planning that unfolded nearby, and realize that survival depended not just on vigilance, but on understanding the mind of someone who regarded human life as both tool and target. You step back into the shadowed streets of the village, now quiet except for the faint drip of water from the eaves, and you probably won't survive long assuming justice here is fair or predictable. Medieval law was a curious beast, a mix of rigid codes, superstition, and spectacle, and for those accused, or suspected, of serial crimes, it could be both shield and trap. Tonight, you follow the twisted path of torture and confessions, where fear and coercion shape the historical record as much as actual guilt. Interrogation was rarely straightforward. Suspects were often confined in dark, cramped spaces, deprived of sleep, or exposed to psychological pressure until their minds surrendered. You imagine a shadowy chamber lit by flickering torchlight, where someone trembles on a stool, hands bound, heart hammering as questions are asked again and again. Historians still argue whether confessions extracted under duress reflect truth, exaggeration, or pure fabrication. In many cases, what was recorded as a serial crime may have been a combination of rumor, coerced confession, and misinterpretation. The methods used were as inventive as they were terrifying. From the application of extreme heat or cold to the use of weights and stretching devices, torturers exploited pain to break both body and mind. Yet, it wasn't only physical suffering. Isolation, intimidation, and the deliberate confusion of suspects were psychological tools designed to compel compliance. You probably wouldn't survive long if you faced such scrutiny unprepared, because even the strongest resolve could falter under this relentless pressure. Quirky and macabre anecdotes are sprinkled throughout records. Some inquisitors reportedly forced suspects to repeat prayers while enduring discomfort, claiming divine will would reveal the truth. Others tested guilt by asking questions that seemed nonsensical, observing microexpressions, or using unusual instruments, like dripping cold water on sensitive spots, to gauge reactions. Historians still debate how systematic or chaotic these methods truly were, but they illuminate the human tendency to turn fear into authority. Courts were as much theater as they were tribunals. Public trials often displayed the accused in ways designed to terrify witnesses, reinforce social norms, and assert the power of law and church. Imagine a condemned person paraded through the marketplace, chains clinking, faces turned in judgment, murmurs running like a current through the crowd. You probably wouldn't survive long if you underestimated the psychological impact of such spectacles. They were as effective at controlling behavior as any execution. Confessions, when obtained, were often dramatic and detailed, sometimes describing crimes in ways that seem exaggerated or symbolic to modern readers. Alleged serial killers might admit to fantastical acts, supernatural pacts, or impossible feats. Some historians suggest these embellishments served multiple purposes, satisfying public curiosity, reinforcing moral lessons, and solidifying the authority of the inquisitors. You can almost hear the whispers among villagers. Did you hear what he confessed? 7 children, a wolf's mask, at the solstice, fear, rumor, and spectacle merged seamlessly. Not all justice was violent, however. Local councils, village elders, and guild leaders sometimes imposed fines, ostracism, or temporary confinement. Yet, even these measures were imbued with psychological power, shaping reputations and influencing future behavior. You probably wouldn't survive long ignoring the subtle mechanisms of social enforcement. Survival often depended on navigating both official and unofficial systems of control. Quirky practices often intersected with superstition. Suspects were sometimes subjected to trial by ordeal, holding hot iron, being submerged in water, or carrying weighted objects while walking. The idea was that divine judgment would reveal guilt, yet the reality was unpredictably cruel. Historians still argue whether outcomes reflected divine intervention, physical resilience, or sheer chance. But in any case, the method reinforced fear, obedience, and spectacle simultaneously. Even records themselves were suspect. Chroniclers might exaggerate events, conflate different cases, or inject moralistic lessons into narratives. A single serial killer might be credited with dozens of crimes across multiple villages, creating an enduring legend rather than an accurate account. You probably wouldn't survive long trusting every story at face value. Critical observation and skepticism were essential tools, even then. As you move past the courthouse or inquisitorial hall, the weight of observation presses down. Torture and confessions weren't only about punishment. They shaped perception, influenced behavior, and created enduring myths of criminality. You notice how fear was wielded as both deterrent and entertainment, blurring lines between justice and cruelty. In the medieval world, survival depended on understanding the rules of power, the tools of intimidation, and the way stories themselves could become instruments of control. You step away from the echoes of the courthouse and into the forested outskirts, the moonlight filtering through dense branches, casting jagged shadows that dance across the uneven ground. You probably won't survive long if you assume that forests were only places of peace or natural beauty, because they were also playgrounds for the cunning and predatory minds that haunted medieval Europe. Here, the isolation, tangled undergrowth, and labyrinthine paths created perfect conditions for killers who thrived in secrecy. Forest killers relied on the natural environment as both ally and weapon. Dense trees provided cover, rivers and marshes offered escape routes, and the natural sounds of wildlife masked their movements. You can imagine a figure crouched beneath a canopy, watching a lone traveler pause to adjust a boot or check a map, oblivious to the danger inches away. Historians still argue whether many forest crimes were the work of organized killers, solitary predators, or opportunistic brigands, but the psychological terror they induced was very real. Some killers in these environments were notorious for their cunning and methodical strategies. They observed routines, studied patterns, and exploited weaknesses with patience that could stretch for weeks. You probably wouldn't survive long if you ignored these behavioral patterns. A single misstep, a moment of hesitation, or a distraction could mean the difference between life and death. One fringe story tells of a killer who left small tokens, like carved sticks or feathers, to signal both territory and prior victims, a blend of superstition and personal signature that blurred fact and folklore. The forest itself was a character in the story. Narrow trails forced travelers into predictable paths. Thick underbrush hid both predator and trap, and natural obstacles could mask footprints or erase evidence. Killers used these features to their advantage, creating ambushes that seemed almost predestined. You probably wouldn't survive unprepared. Every sound, shadow, and movement had to be scrutinized as part of a living, breathing landscape that could shift in an instant from benign to deadly. Social dynamics played a role even here. Villagers often relied on guides or locals who knew the terrain, trusting strangers implicitly. Sometimes these guides were complicit, luring travelers into danger for profit, revenge, or sadistic amusement. Historians still argue how widespread such betrayal was, but the danger of misplaced trust remained a recurring theme. You can almost feel the weight of suspicion in every interaction, every glance, every offered hand or gesture. Quirky tales from forested crimes survive in local lore. Some killers allegedly used animal decoys, leaving wolf pelts or caged birds to startle or confuse victims. Others may have employed rudimentary traps, hidden pits, tripwires, or sharpened stakes to create fatal obstacles. While historians debate the authenticity of these accounts, they highlight the inventiveness and opportunistic nature of medieval predation. You probably wouldn't survive ignoring the combination of environment and human cunning. The forest was as much a tool as it was a hiding place. Psychology was key. Killers manipulated fear, timing, and perception to maintain control. A rustle in the underbrush, a snapping twig, or the sudden appearance of a shadow could immobilize victims long enough for an attack. You probably wouldn't survive without awareness and mental acuity. The predator's advantage was amplified by the human mind's susceptibility to panic and expectation. Legends often elevated real killers into almost supernatural beings. Forest-dwelling murderers were sometimes depicted as spirits, demons, or cursed figures, blending fact and folklore in a way that perpetuated fear. Historians still argue how much of these accounts were based on real events versus narrative embellishment, but the psychological impact on communities was undeniable. Even a simple nighttime journey through the woods could feel like a gauntlet of potential threats, where every shadow could harbor intent. Finally, you trudge past an abandoned clearing, imagining the layered strategies of killers who used natural features, human psychology, and social dynamics to lethal effect. Survival depended not just on speed or strength, but on observation, intuition, and understanding the patterns of both predator and environment. You probably wouldn't survive long ignoring these lessons. In the medieval world, even the seemingly serene forest was a stage for deadly minds at play. You leave the forest behind and find yourself trudging along a riverbank, the water murmuring softly against stones, reflecting the pale glow of the moon. It's easy to forget that in medieval times, rivers were not just lifelines, but also stages for some of the most cunning and chilling acts of predation. You probably won't survive long assuming these waters are harmless, because murderers often exploited the natural world, using currents, docks, and boats as instruments of fear and opportunity. Rivers were vital for trade, travel, and communication, which made them attractive hunting grounds. Merchants, fishermen, and travelers relied on boats to carry goods and news, and isolation on the water created perfect conditions for attacks. You can imagine someone in a small rowboat, shadowed by reeds, watching the approach of an unwitting traveler, silently timing the moment when fear and opportunity align. Historians still argue whether attacks on waterways were opportunistic or premeditated serial crimes, but the consequences were immediate and terrifying. Water itself could be weaponized. Some killers staged drownings to appear accidental, while others used rivers to dispose of evidence or victims, hiding their crimes beneath currents and mud. You probably wouldn't survive long without vigilance if you were traveling alone. Every boat, bridge, and dock carried both utility and hidden danger. One fringe tale describes a predator who tied weighted objects to unsuspecting victims to accelerate their descent into the river, a gruesome strategy that left little trace but an enduring aura of dread. The psychology of river-based killers often involved patience and observation. They studied the rhythms of tides, the timing of crossings, and the habits of locals. You probably wouldn't survive long ignoring these patterns. Awareness of the environment could mean the difference between safe passage and fatal miscalculation. Some legends even describe killers using reflections, moonlight, or fog to create illusions, manipulating perception to disorient victims before striking. Historians debate whether these stories are literal or embellished, but they underscore the creative use of natural elements in criminal acts. Rivers also intersected with superstition. People believed certain bends, rapids, or groves were cursed or haunted, and these beliefs could be exploited by those with malicious intent. A killer might stage a haunted scene to frighten a victim into isolation or misstep, combining natural fear with human cunning. You can almost see the flicker of a torch on the water's edge, the glint of a blade concealed beneath a cloak, and the terror of someone realizing too late that their environment has become a trap. Quirky accounts survive in historical chronicles. Some killers reportedly left carved symbols on riverbanks or tied small tokens to stakes as warnings or as signatures. Others disguised themselves as fishermen, ferrymen, or boatmen, blending seamlessly into daily life while plotting lethal encounters. Historians still argue whether these were common practices or rare anomalies amplified by storytelling, but the psychological impact on travelers and communities was undeniable. You probably wouldn't survive ignoring the intersection of social trust and environmental hazards. Rivers amplified both opportunity and isolation. Narrow crossings, foggy mornings, and remote banks made it easy to isolate a target. Even communal ferries or docks offered moments of vulnerability. A momentary distraction, a delayed handshake, or a misstep could have fatal consequences. You notice how human error and environmental complexity intersected, giving killers the advantage of planning, concealment, and unpredictability. Interestingly, some killers used local knowledge of currents and tides to cover tracks or stage plausible accidents. Bodies might never surface, evidence could wash away, and the community would be left with unanswered questions. Historians still debate how much intentional strategy versus coincidence played a role, but the result was a pervasive sense of unease. You probably wouldn't survive without a heightened awareness of both human and natural variables. The river itself was a silent accomplice. Finally, rivers were stages for the unexpected. Even routine activities, fetching water, fishing, or transporting goods, carried risk. The medieval mindset, shaped by superstition, law, and the reality of opportunistic killers, treated waterways as spaces requiring vigilance, respect, and caution. You trudge along the bank, imagining the delicate dance of predator and prey, and realize that survival often depended on observation, anticipation, and understanding that even the gentle flow of water could conceal deadly intent. You trudge into the dimly lit streets of a bustling medieval town, where the smell of wood smoke and market spices mingles with the ever-present tang of manure and unwashed bodies. You probably won't survive long assuming that crowds guarantee safety, because within the throngs of townsfolk, marketplaces, and taverns lurked killers who thrived on anonymity, exploiting both chaos and human distraction. Urban killers relied on the density and movement of people to conceal their actions. Pickpockets, street thieves, and more lethal predators could strike unnoticed, blending seamlessly with merchants, laborers, and children running errands. Imagine a shadow slipping between stalls, a hand brushing a cloak to drop a small, hidden dagger or a vial of powder. Historians still argue whether some urban crimes were the work of serial killers or simply opportunistic criminals, but the stories passed down instilled pervasive fear in daily life. Markets and taverns were particularly risky. Crowds created confusion, noise masked the faintest whispers, and the chaos allowed predators to isolate targets subtly. You probably wouldn't survive long assuming that public scrutiny prevented harm. The very bustle that suggested safety often became a hunter's ally. Fringe accounts tell of killers using stage tricks, sudden distractions, or minor scuffles to divert attention, providing the perfect window for a strike. Whether true or exaggerated, these tales highlight the ingenuity and patience of those who exploited the urban environment. Urban killers were also masters of disguise and social engineering. Some posed as beggars, merchants, or town criers, learning routines and timing to identify vulnerable individuals. You can almost see the careful observation, noting the wealth of a passerby, the attention of guards, the presence of companions. Knowledge of human behavior, local customs, and daily rhythms became a weapon as precise as any blade or poison. Historians still debate the line between calculated seriality and opportunistic crime, but the psychological terror remained tangible. Quirky stories survive from the period. Some killers allegedly used pigeons, mirrors, or reflective metal to signal accomplices across crowded squares. Others reportedly used coded knocks or spoken phrases, allowing them to manipulate groups while isolating a single target. You probably wouldn't survive ignoring the combination of environmental awareness and social cues. Every detail could indicate a hidden threat. The psychology of urban predation relied heavily on distraction. Noise, conflict, and spectacle were tools as much as concealment. Street performers, children, and market animals could serve as unintentional accomplices in a crime, diverting attention just long enough. You notice how human unpredictability both aided and hindered predators, creating an intricate dance of observation, timing, and subtle manipulation. Law enforcement in towns was uneven. Town guards, sheriffs, or watchmen often had limited reach, leaving gaps that killers could exploit. Communities developed informal vigilance systems, neighbors watching neighbors, merchants coordinating security, and families traveling in groups. Yet, even these measures could fail, particularly against predators who understood routines, social structures, and human psychology. You probably wouldn't survive ignoring these layers of control and vulnerability. Some killers combined fear with folklore. Urban legends described shadowy figures, masked strangers, or spectral apparitions moving through streets at night, instilling caution or hysteria. Historians still argue whether these accounts reflect actual criminals or the amplification of fear through oral tradition. But the effect on behavior was real. People altered routes, avoided certain markets, and even slept with one eye open. Finally, urban killers were opportunists, planners, and performers all at once. Their environment dictated tactics, yet human behavior was equally critical. You trudge past a dim alleyway, imagining a predator blending with the crowd, timing movements, reading reactions, and exploiting fear. Survival in medieval towns depended on vigilance, quick thinking, and a deep understanding that even in numbers, you were never truly alone or truly safe. You trudge along the outskirts of a monastery-ruined village, where the skeletal remains of buildings jut into the fog, and the air carries the musty scent of rot and damp earth. You probably won't survive long, assuming history only remembers kings, battles, and saints, because in these shadowed ruins, the lesser-known but deadly minds of medieval serial killers emerge, blending folklore, fact, and nightmare. Some killers specialized in exploiting societal superstitions. They understood that fear of the supernatural could be manipulated to control behavior, hide crimes, or eliminate rivals. Imagine a figure leaving unsettling symbols on doors, using shadows and masks to suggest curses or possession. Historians still argue whether such acts were genuine belief, clever manipulation, or later embellishment, but their impact on communities was tangible. Entire villages could be paralyzed by fear, offering predators freedom to strike unnoticed. Isolation was their greatest ally. In abandoned or partially ruined villages, few people remained to observe, intervene, or report. You probably wouldn't survive long wandering alone in such spaces, where a single misstep could bring you into the path of someone exploiting decay, darkness, and human vulnerability. One fringe tale tells of a killer using the ruins as a maze, guiding victims through crumbling walls and hidden passages to disorient and trap them, turning architecture itself into a weapon. Motivations varied. Some killers acted out of revenge, obsession, or greed, targeting those they perceived as threats or obstacles. Others were driven by twisted curiosity or compulsion, studying human reactions in fear, anticipation, and confusion. You can almost feel the tension as someone moves silently behind a ruined wall, noting every sound, every shadow, every sign of panic. Historians still debate the extent to which compulsion, malice, or circumstance drove these individuals, but their crimes left an indelible mark on local memory. Quirky accounts add an unsettling layer. Some serial killers allegedly used animals to aid their schemes: crows to scout, dogs to flush out targets, or cats to leave subtle signs for allies. Others reportedly left calling cards, unusual items arranged at the scene, small tokens that whispered their presence without exposing identity. Whether fact or legend, these details illustrate the creativity and audacity of medieval minds operating outside conventional morality. Survival in abandoned spaces required more than caution. It required understanding human behavior, patterns of fear, and the psychology of both predator and prey. Killers could manipulate the mind as effectively as the environment, using darkness, sound, and subtle cues to create terror and maintain control. You probably wouldn't survive long ignoring these lessons. An empty village, after all, is only truly empty if you fail to read the signs left behind. Communities responded as best they could. Rituals, charms, and folk practices proliferated, sometimes deterring predation, sometimes amplifying fear. People might mark thresholds with symbols, carry protective herbs, or travel in groups, hoping to outwit unseen threats. Historians still argue about the efficacy of such measures, but their psychological impact was clear. Fear was a survival tool as well as a weapon. Fringe tales also suggest that some killers exploited seasonal phenomena, fog, moon phases, or river swells, to enhance their operations. You probably wouldn't survive ignoring these environmental cues. Timing and observation could mean the difference between safe passage and fatal encounter. The killer's use of nature itself as an accomplice highlights the interplay between cunning, opportunity, and context in medieval predation. Finally, you trudge past the skeletal remains of a once thriving village square, imagining the layered strategies of those who thrived in shadow. They combine psychological insight, environmental mastery, and social understanding, leaving traces of fear, legend, and horror long after their deeds. You probably wouldn't survive ignoring the lessons. In the medieval world, even ruins could harbor intelligence, intent, and deadly precision. You trudge into the twilight of a mist-shrouded countryside, where the soft croak of frogs and the distant hoot of an owl fill the heavy air. You probably won't survive long assuming that rural life meant simplicity or safety, because here, killers moved quietly among peasants, shepherds, and isolated homesteads, exploiting both solitude and the limits of medieval communication. Rural serial predators often relied on patience, observation, and intimate knowledge of local terrain. They knew every path, stream, and hidden hollow, allowing them to strike and vanish without leaving evidence. You can almost see a figure crouched beneath a hedgerow, watching a lone farmer return from the fields, timing the moment when shadows and human distraction converge. Historians still argue whether some of these criminals were true serial killers or simply opportunistic murderers, but the fear they inspired was very real. Isolation magnified vulnerability. Small villages and scattered farms meant fewer witnesses and delayed responses. You probably wouldn't survive long assuming neighbors could intervene quickly. In some cases, the closest help was miles away, giving predators an unchallenged window to act. Fringe tales suggest some killers used bells, whistles, or other sounds to lure victims, taking advantage of superstition and rural expectations. Whether entirely factual or embellished, these stories highlight the ingenuity of human malice in environments that seemed benign. Motivation in rural contexts was often pragmatic, but no less chilling. Theft, revenge, and disputes over land or livestock could escalate into murder, while some individuals acted out of obsession, compulsion, or desire for notoriety. You notice the pattern. Victims were chosen for accessibility, routine, or perceived weakness, emphasizing that cunning often outweighed brute strength in medieval predation. Historians still debate whether economic or psychological incentives predominated in these cases, but the consequences were universally dire. Quirky details color the lore. Some rural killers reportedly used animals, trained dogs, crows, or goats, to signal their presence or help isolate victims. Others left unusual items as signatures, such as a carved stick or a flower placed in a doorway, blending superstition with psychological manipulation. You probably wouldn't survive ignoring these subtle cues. They were often the only warning a victim might have. Community response was both practical and ritualistic. Villagers traveled in groups when possible, hung protective charms, and avoided known danger zones after dusk. Yet even these measures could fail against a patient and knowledgeable predator. You trudge past a thatched cottage, imagining the calculated observation required to avoid detection, the rhythm of footsteps, the pause to listen, the anticipation of human behavior under pressure. Psychology played a central role. Killers manipulated fear and expectation, isolating victims subtly and exploiting cognitive biases. Even a simple misdirection, a dropped tool, a false trail, or a whispered rumor could have fatal consequences. You probably wouldn't survive long if you ignored the mental games at play. The predator's intellect often compensated for lack of weaponry or brute force. Legends arose around these rural killers, transforming them into almost mythical figures. Stories of shadowy figures, supernatural prowess, or impossible cunning circulated from village to village, reinforcing caution while feeding communal imagination. Historians still argue how much was fact, embellishment, or moralistic storytelling, but the practical effect was clear. Vigilance became habitual, and fear was an essential survival tool. Finally, the rural landscape itself was a weapon. Woods, hills, rivers, and fields were integrated into predatory strategy, offering concealment, escape, and opportunity. You trudge along the foggy edge of a field, imagining a predator using the terrain to orchestrate disappearance and terror. You probably wouldn't survive ignoring the interplay between environment, psychology, and opportunity. In medieval times, even the most idyllic countryside could conceal deadly mines at work. You trudge toward the edges of a crumbling city, where the last remnants of stone walls crumble into dust and ivy, and the wind carries the faint, bittersweet scent of both decay and renewal. You probably won't survive long assuming that the stories of medieval killers are merely tales. They were very real, and their echoes lingered across towns, forests, rivers, and ruins, shaping the way people lived, feared, and observed one another. By this stage, the patterns are unmistakable. Opportunity, observation, cunning, and psychology dictated survival more than strength or luck. Medieval serial killers exploited every environment, from castles to monasteries, rivers to markets, forests to villages. They understood human behavior, manipulated perception, and used both the natural and constructed worlds to their advantage. You can almost feel the web they wove, threads of fear, suspicion, and anticipation stretching across every settlement. Historians still argue how many of these acts were truly serial in nature, as opposed to opportunistic killings exaggerated by rumor or legend, but the psychological imprint is undeniable. Some killers became almost legendary, their exploits retold to warn, entertain, or moralize. Tales of hooded figures in alleys, masked assassins in markets, shadowy watchers in forests, and cunning manipulators in sacred spaces circulated widely. You probably wouldn't survive long discounting these stories outright. They often contained kernels of truth woven into exaggeration and folklore, preserving lessons about vigilance, trust, and human unpredictability. Quirky stories abound. Some killers reportedly communicated with accomplices via animals, signals, or small tokens. Others left deliberate signatures to mark territory or create fear. Ritualistic timing, manipulation of environmental cues, and psychological games were standard tools. Even in the smallest village or quietest hamlet, subtle intelligence and observation could turn ordinary spaces into deadly stages. You notice how ingenuity, creativity, and patience often outweighed brute force in these tales. Community responses evolved over time. Villagers, town councils, and even religious institutions developed systems of vigilance, signaling, and protective ritual. Charms, group travel, watch rotations, and encoded warnings became part of daily life. Historians still argue whether these measures were practical or largely symbolic, but their psychological impact was clear. Fear became an organizing principle, shaping behavior and social norms. What emerges from these stories is a nuanced portrait of medieval life, one where danger lurked in shadow and light, where ordinary spaces could conceal extraordinary malice, and where survival depended on awareness, adaptability, and psychological acuity. You probably wouldn't survive long ignoring these lessons, because danger rarely announced itself. It relied on patience, cunning, and observation. Even as civilizations changed, the legacies of these killers persisted. They shaped law, folklore, architecture, and culture, leaving echoes that historians, writers, and storytellers continue to explore. By tracing their methods, motives, and movements, you gain insight into both human darkness and resilience. As you trudge past crumbling walls into the quiet night, the pattern becomes clear. Survival was never guaranteed. Observation, critical thinking, understanding human psychology, and respect for both natural and social environments were essential. The deadliest minds of medieval times operated across every strata of society, leaving cautionary tales that endure. And as you reflect on the shadows behind every story, you probably won't survive long if you forget that history's hidden horrors often thrive where vigilance wanes and fear is underestimated. Now let's slow our pace. You've trudged through forests, rivers, villages, and castles, following the hidden, cunning minds that shaped medieval fear. The tension, the uncertainty, the whisper of danger, it lingers, but for tonight, you can let it fade. Imagine the moonlight softening over quiet fields, the trees rustling gently, and the soft hum of the wind carrying away the last shadows of danger. Every figure you've imagined, every cunning predator, recedes into history, leaving only lessons in vigilance, observation, and human complexity. Your heartbeat slows as you picture empty streets, silent corridors, and abandoned riverbanks. The world grows calm, even in memory, and you realize that what once seemed threatening is now a story, a reflection of human cunning, resilience, and adaptability. You've walked beside fear, yet you remain unharmed, carrying knowledge that centuries of people learned only through vigilance and experience. The air cools, your muscles relax, and even the faint, distant echo of a medieval bell feels like a lullaby rather than a warning. Fear can teach, but it can also release, and now it drifts away with every exhale. You've seen the strategies, the psychology, the environments, and the quirks of those deadly minds, and now you can allow your mind to rest. Let your thoughts wander to the ordinary, the gentle rhythm of modern life, the warmth of a hearth, the safety of your room. The stories remain, tucked into the corners of your imagination, vivid but contained. Your mind has traversed danger, yet you are here, calm and aware. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let the lessons, the stories, and the lingering shadows dissolve into a gentle, restful quiet. Sweet dreams.